Who was hiding behind Shakespeare's mask? Unraveling the greatest literary mystery. Let's dive into one of the juiciest mysteries in literary history. Who really wrote the plays and poems we know as William Shakespeare's? This question has been buzzing around for centuries, captivating scholars, historians, and anyone who loves a good conspiracy theory. It all kicks off on May 30th, 1593, when a gifted young English poet and playwright, Christopher Marlowe, gets stabbed to death in a tavern in Deptford, a small town just outside London. Then, just 2 weeks later, a steamy little poem called Venus and Adonis hits the shelves, signed with a mysterious name William Shakespeare. Coincidence? Or the start of a wild detective story? Today, it's no big secret that some folks think Shakespeare might have been a front-a-pen name or even a stand-in for the real genius or geniuses behind the works. And one of the top suspects? That same Christopher Marlowe, who might not have died after all. Buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into this tale, mixing in some history, a bit of economic context, and a whole lot of what-ifs to turn this into a big, juicy article 15,000 words of intrigue, American style. Let's go! Christopher Marlowe, genius, spy, or both? First off, who was this Christopher Marlowe guy? Born in 1564, the same year as Shakespeare, in the quiet town of Canterbury, England, he didn't exactly come from money. His dad was a shoemaker, his mom kept the house running, and life was pretty modest. But Marlowe, he was a standout from the get-go. Smart as a whip, he landed a spot at the King's School in Canterbury, a fancy place tied to the famous cathedral, usually reserved for rich kids. How'd a shoemaker's son pull that off? That's our first clue something weird was going on. Later, he scored a scholarship to Cambridge, one of England's top universities back then, a playground for the elite. Historians have scratched their heads over this. How does a kid from the working class end up rubbing elbows with the sons of lords and ladies? Well, it turns out Marlowe might have had some powerful friends. Big shots like Thomas Walsingham, Queen Elizabeth I's spymaster, and Lord Burleigh, her top government guy, seemed to take a shine to him. They didn't just help him out, they spoiled him with cash, fancy gifts, and a free pass for all his teenage antics. Here's where it gets spicy. While at Cambridge, Marlowe kept disappearing, taking off to Europe for weeks at a time. Any other student would have been kicked out, but not him. Why? Because, according to some theories, he wasn't just hitting the books, he was working for the Queen's Secret Service. Picture this, a good-looking, brainy kid crisscrossing Europe, digging up dirt on Catholic rebels plotting against England's Protestant Queen. His bosses, Walsingham and Burleigh, might have sent him to France to spy on English Catholics who were stirring up trouble across the Channel. In return, he got the royal treatment money, protection, and a blind eye to his absences. But Marlowe wasn't just a spy, he was a writer, and a darn good one. After Cambridge, he moved to London and started pumping out plays that blew everyone away. His big hits, like Tamburlaine the Great 1587 to 1588, and the tragical history of Dr. Faustus 1588 to 1589, made him the rock star of Elizabethan theatre. People called him England's first great poet, and he earned it. In just a few years, he churned out 6 killer plays and a long poem, shaking up the literary world like nobody before him. The wild world of Queen Elizabeth's court. To get why Marlowe might have morphed into Shakespeare, we've got to zoom out and look at England in the late 1500s. This was no chill time, it was a hot mess of political games, religious beefs, and backstabbing. Queen Elizabeth I ran the show with an iron fist, but her court was a snake pit. Catholics wanted her gone, Protestants were paranoid about conspiracies, and everyone was jockeying for power. Marlowe, some say, was knee-deep in this chaos. Besides writing plays, he hung out with a crew called the University Wits, a bunch of brainy, rebellious writers and poets who weren't afraid to push boundaries. The group's ringleader, Sir Walter Raleigh, the Queen's golden boy, and a total wild card. These guys didn't just write, they debated big ideas, flirted with blasphemy, and sometimes got into sketchy stuff that made the church clutch its pearls. Marlowe, working for the spymaster Walsingham, supposedly kept tabs on them, reporting back anything too radical. Now, here's a curveball for you. Some folks whisper that Queen Elizabeth herself might have been hiding a secret. There's this wild theory that the real Elizabeth died as a kid and was swapped out for a boy to keep the throne secure. Sounds nuts, right? But it could explain why her court was obsessed with pretty young guys who shot up the ranks out of nowhere. Marlowe, talented, charming, and easy on the eyes, fit the bill perfectly. Whether the queen was a dude or not, one thing's clear. Her inner circle was a weird, tangled web, and Marlowe was right in the middle. A staged death in Deptford. Fast forward to May 1593. Marlowe's living large in London, but trouble's brewing. The city's a powder keg. Catholics and Protestants are clashing, and pamphlets trashing Flemish immigrants are popping up everywhere. The Privy Council, the Queen's top enforcers, start sniffing around the literary crowd, hunting for whoever's stirring the pot. They zero in on the university wits, and Marlowe's name comes up. Worse, the church led by the Archbishop of Canterbury wants him too, accusing him of heresy and blasphemy. Suddenly, he's a wanted man. Then, bam, on May 30th, he's dead. The story goes like this. Marlowe's hanging out in a Deptford tavern with three shady characters. An argument breaks out over the bill, and one of them, Ingram Fraser, stabs him in the eye. End of story, right? Not so fast. Check out who these guys were. Fraser was Walsingham's personal servant, and the other two, active spies for the Queen's intelligence network. The guy who wrote up the death report, a cop from the secret police who just happened to be there. The next day, Marlowe's body gets dumped in a mass plague pit. No funeral, no mourners, nothing. For a guy with rich friends and a big family, that's weird. And get this, Queen Elizabeth herself orders all the paperwork sealed up tight. Those docs didn't see daylight until 1925, when a grad student named Leslie Hodson dug them up. What he found? A report that smells more like a cover-up than a murder case. Here's the kicker. The day after Marlowe dies, a ship sails out of town, captained by his uncle, Anthony Marlowe. Why the rush? Who was on that boat? A lot of people think Marlowe didn't die, that his buddies in high places faked it to save him from the Privy Council, the church, and a whole lot of enemies. With London crawling with spies and the plague raging, a staged death might have been his ticket out. Enter William Shakespeare. Real deal or front man? Right after Marlowe's death, something wild happens. 2 weeks later, Venus and Adonis drops, credited to some guy named William Shakespeare. Then the hits keep coming, plays, sonnets, you name it, until Shakespeare becomes the biggest name in theater history. But who was he, really? Official story says Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, a small town about 100 miles from London. His dad made gloves, and young Will didn't get much schooling, no college, no fancy tutors. As a kid, he helped out at a butcher shop and got busted for poaching deer. Eventually, he moves to London and breaks into theater, not as a writer, but as a doorman, watching horses for rich folks coming to shows. Later, he lands small acting gigs with Richard Burbage's troupe, playing bit parts like Hamlet's dad's ghost. He's not exactly lighting up the stage. People say he's kinda terrible. Then, out of nowhere, things flip. By 1594, Shakespeare's got cash, big cash. He's lending money, buying a house, living the high life. In 1595, he's a co-owner of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and by 1599, he's part owner of the Globe Theatre. In 1596, he even snags a coat of arms, basically a ticket to the upper crust. Where's all this money coming from? And how's a guy with no education writing masterpieces about Italy, ancient Rome, and royal court stuff he's never seen? Dig deeper, and it gets weirder. There's no proof Shakespeare ever got paid for writing. Theater owners like Philip Henslow kept meticulous records of payments to playwrights. Marlowe's in there, but Shakespeare, not a trace. No manuscripts, no letters about his work, nothing. After he dies in 1616, there's not even a legit portrait. The famous ones, like the flower portrait from 1609, turn out to be fakes or someone else entirely. Marlowe equals Shakespeare? The evidence piles up. Back in the late 1800s, an American physicist named Thomas Mendenhall came up with a way to analyze writing styles. He ran the numbers on Shakespeare's works and compared them to other writers of the time. Guess whose stuff matched Shakespeare's down to the sentence structure and word choice? Christopher Marlowe's. It was like finding DNA evidence in a cold case. Here's the theory. Marlowe doesn't die in 1593. He skips town maybe to Italy and keeps writing. His plays and poems get smuggled back to England, where the Shakespeare guy puts his name on them. Shakespeare, the small-time actor with no schooling, becomes the front man, raking in the cash while Marlowe stays off the radar. It fits, doesn't it? Marlowe had the talent, the education, and the connections. Shakespeare had, well, a good cover story. Why it matters, a tale of fame and secrets. This isn't just some old English gossip, it's a story about how legends are born and truths get buried. If Marlowe was Shakespeare, it explains the money, the genius, and the holes in Shakespeare's bio. But we'll probably never know for sure. Too many records are gone, and too much time has passed. So, what do you think? Was Shakespeare the real deal, or just a mask for Marlowe? Hit me with your takes. This mystery's too good not to chew over.